I'm going to do this top 10 of 2025 in a way that's probably going to destroy its performance in the algorithm, because I'm not going to do this the traditional way. I'm not going to start at number 10 and go to number 1. I'm going to start with number 1 and work my way down to number 10. And I know that's not the smart way to do things, but the rants I have about these books that I read this year won't make sense unless I tell you about number 2 before some of the ones lower down on the list. So I'm going to risk it for the biscuit and hope it pays off. And I'm going to start with the number 1 book of the year, which was Book of the Long Sun by Gene Wolfe. And this, of course, is his sequel series to his most famous book, his most well-known book, which is Book of the New Sun. But if you go into it expecting Book of the New Sun, if you read it as a sequel, you'll probably end up being disappointed. Because instead of following a torturer who's expelled from his guild, you follow a priest trying to save his people. Instead of a dying Earth setting, you're in a retro-futuristic setting, kind of similar to Fallout. Instead of following one point of view, you're bounced from character to character to character throughout these 4 books. But just because it's different doesn't mean it's not as good. He does things with these characters that seem like they're impossible. He has a priest, a righteous priest, become a criminal. He has a robot experience humanity. He has a prostitute being elevated to the level of a deity. It's incredible. And I talk about this a lot more in my full review that I've already done of this series. So you can watch that if you want to learn more. The only other thing I'll say is that technically The Long Sun is a series. So if I had to pick just one book from it, it would be Night Side of the Long Sun. Because following Patera's Silk in that book, being introduced to him, his world, and his story is something I wish I could relive again and again and again, which is why I'll go ahead and put Night Side of the Long Sun as my number 1 book of 2025. Okay, so this next book, book number 2, my second favorite book of 2025, is the book that not only wrecked my 2025 TBR that I created at the beginning of the year, but is the reason I'm having to do this list backwards, going from number 1 to 10 instead of 10 to 1. Not only that, but because of my experience, because of how much I loved this book and fell in love with this book, it derailed the rest of my reading plans for 2025 and made it so that from the time I read this book to the end of the year, there was only one book I read in that time that was actually on my TBR. The rest was in the same sort of subgenre that this book is in. It took me down a rabbit hole of non-TBR books. And what's strange is that this book isn't even commonly considered a fantasy book. It's described as fiction or a classic. But I'm going to go ahead and quote Gene Wolfe and say that all books are fantasy. Some are just more honest about it. So my number 2 book of the year is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. And Treasure Island is one of those classic books we were all supposed to read. And yet somehow I never did. In fact, I had no intention of ever reading Treasure Island, let alone reading it this year. The only reason it even came into my world, the only reason why I gave it any attention was because I recently rewatched the underrated masterpiece that is Treasure Planet and learned that that incredible movie was based off of Treasure Island. And I love Treasure Planet, both as a kid and now even as an adult. When I rewatched it, I was amazed by how much it stood its ground. So after I watched that movie, I was sitting there feeling a little hungover from the story and wanting more. And I saw it was inspired by Treasure Island, so I decided to go towards the source material and read Treasure Island. And even though this book was so much different from the movie, I was not disappointed, to say the least. Like, the thought that I might have gone my entire life without ever reading this book is super sad because it's hands down one of the most incredible books I've ever read. And I think it's one of those books that every single person watching this video should read. Every single person, period, should read this book and pick it up. Fantasy readers are going to love its adventure and its quest for treasure. History readers or historical fiction readers will love its connection and setting to historical England and the experience of life on an 18th century sailing ship. And lovers of philosophy, or simply people who like reading books with deeper themes or messaging in them, will enjoy the end results of seeing the men who spend their entire life pursuing treasure and vice, of watching people who see only today instead of what can happen tomorrow, and seeing where and how different types of men find meaning and morality. They're going to love it. Like, if I had to sell you this book in only 3 sentences, I would say this is a fast-paced short story that brings you back to your childhood days of discovery, wonder, and adventure. 2, I would say that it's the most easily digestible classic I've ever read, and one of the most deserving of the title of classic. And 3, you'll get to see the origin of pirate tropes and the devious pirate many of these tropes come from in the first place. And like I said, this big book literally destroyed my reading plans for this year because I could not get this book out of my head. I literally took 2 weeks off of reading entirely and just thought and explored the story, not ready to let go of what I had just read. And I tried to soak up the reasons why this book affected me so much. And on top of that, after I was finally ready to move on and pick up my next book, I wasn't ready to let go of pirates. So I picked up more pirate fantasy and more nautical adventures or just seafaring adventures in general. I ended up reading 3 other books, all 3 of which made it onto this top 10 list that are in that pirate subgenre of fantasy or just nautical adventures in general. That was a lot about that book, but Treasure Island was one of the best books I've ever read and is absolutely incredible and is my second favorite book of 2025. Moving on to my third favorite book of the year, it's one of those 3 books I read after Treasure Island that is in that nautical, seafaring, pirate subgenre. And to all you pure fantasy readers out there who watch my channel, because I'm a fantasy channel, this isn't fantasy. But every other book on this list will be. So if this book doesn't interest you, just ignore it. But as a fantasy reader, I love this book. So maybe that will get your attention. But anyways, number 3 on this list is none other than Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And this book is impossible for me to be objective about for so many reasons, not the least of which being that this book is considered the great American novel. But more than that, I don't know if I would have liked this book or even enjoyed this book at all if I had read it in any other season of my life. So I picked this book up when I was craving that nautical pirate fantasy because of Treasure Island. And even though it's not a pirate book, this book did scratch that nautical seafaring itch perfectly. But more than that, I feel like the past 4 years have prepared me to pick up this book, especially reading books, especially reading Gene Wolfe in particular has prepared me for Moby Dick. A perfect example is that quote by Ursula K. Le Guin saying that Wolfe is our Melville. I used to think that was simply her saying like Gene Wolfe is the greatest science fiction author of all time, that Book of the New Sun was the greatest science fiction work of all time, and that could be the great American novel. I thought that's what she was saying, and I think she is, but she's also saying so much more. And for those of you that haven't read this book, that might be confusing for you because like before I read this book, all I heard about Moby Dick is that it was the great American novel and maybe the greatest book of all time. What I hadn't heard anyone say is that it's one of the weirdest, craziest books you'll ever read that doesn't make any sense of how it's written. Like the first part starts out pretty normal. It's a man ready to set out on a sea adventure. The middle of this book, though, is like an encyclopedia about whales. It's philosophy and almost poetry about the whaling industry and life aboard a sailing ship. And the last bit is about Captain Ahab finally finding his great white whale, Moby Dick. And like that doesn't even sound all that weird, but the writing style is super jarring as well. Like this book is not written following the typical rules of writing. Melville writes part of this as a traditional first-person recounting of his voyage, but he also slips in a third-person point of views and different point of views while writing completely other parts of this book like a play with stage directions and things like that. And I think that's a huge reason why I think Wolfe prepared me to enjoy this book. From the variance of writing styles, to the unreliable narrator, to the long scientific-esque passages and things, to the archaic Shakespearean language and prose, Wolfe is 100% the Melville of science fiction. So I feel like I'm dragging on about this book, but in conclusion, even if its reputation is partially clouding my love for this book, even if the reputation is skewing my opinion, nothing can change the fact that when I was reading this book, I loved every minute of it. And I read it in a point of my life that made it one of my favorite books of all time. And yes, I do wonder how much of this is based off of this journey I've had and reading it in that perfect timing. But I'll save the full discussion about this for when I do get back to reviewing books on this channel. But Moby Dick was my third favorite book of the year. Next up in the number 4 spot is a book I honestly can't believe I'm ranking so high because there was just so many things wrong with this book. Not only that, but it's my most recent read, so I also hate ranking books right after I read them because I have a very strong recency bias. So that might be tainting what I have to say and my thoughts and feelings about it. By next year, I might be looking back and thinking like, you idiot, it wasn't that good. And then the fact that this follows Moby Dick makes it feel even dirtier ranking it this high. Like putting it in that same category as Moby Dick. But I don't even care. The way this book engaged me is almost embarrassing. And it was for sure one of my favorite reads of the year. And that book is Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. And if you watch my 25 and 2025 video, you'll know that I did not think I would love this book. I thought it would be a very average read for me. But it wasn't. Like, I loved this book. I loved it. And what's so infuriating for me is that I don't think that there's any other book I've had such a disagreement with as far as like creative choices go. Or on the flip side, like I don't think there's another book with such obvious flaws to the character, structure, tone, and executions that I've actually enjoyed, let alone loved to this level. And an example of this is that there's a moment in the beginning of the book where you see the beautiful masterpiece this book could be. How this could be like this perfect combination between horror and romance. And I especially get this during Painter's first encounter with stable nightmares. Like, I remember my shock and chills running down my spine as I realized Brandon Sanderson was actually writing really good horror, to the point that I had goosebumps. For a moment, I had chills. I felt horror, and in the moment, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, Brandon Sanderson, of all people, is writing horror. And I saw this masterpiece flash before my eyes. And then he ruined it. Like, immediately. Like, right after I got that feeling, immediately he ruined it. I was jolted out of the story by Hoyd. And I was literally mad. Like, I was mourning the loss of what I saw this story could have been. And angry that Brandon Sanderson couldn't keep it together and execute such a unique combination when I had just seen that he does have the skill to. He just couldn't keep it together for that moment. And that wasn't the only flaw. There were a bunch others, especially with that decision to have this be a story that Hoyd was telling. Like, I hated that. It oversimplified everything. It ruined the immersion into the tale. And it often felt like it was acting as a weak type of virtue signaling to appease like this very specific subgroup of his audience. Like, and I just hated everything about this choice. And I'm going to leave the rest of this ranting for my full review on the book. But my point is that even with this first quarter of the book setting me up for this huge disappointment, and the book definitely didn't go the way I wished it would, the way I thought it was going to, the story he did write, the story he did tell was incredible. Like, it was beautiful, it was moving, it was inspiring, and it ended up being one of my favorite reads of the year. And it might go down as one of my favorite Sanderson novels of all time. And my heart still does kind of mourn for what that story could have been, but the story that he did write was brilliantly executed. But even with me loving this book as much as I do, there is a lot wrong with it. And I think is a book that is best enjoyed by fans of Sanderson and the Cosmere, and not just a book I would throw out to everyone and be like, here, you're going to love this book. This is undebatably a really great book. I don't think it's universally great. I think this is top tier for fans of the Cosmere. Since we're speaking of books that are full of flaws, yet some of my favorites, next up in number 5 is actually a reread that was also not on my TBR, and I guess technically this was the first book I read that wasn't on my TBR, not Treasure Island. But that's besides the point. The point is that this book was just as good the second time around as the first, and maybe even a little better. Because like I said, this book was flawed, but during this reread, I didn't notice the flaws. I didn't focus on them. I was just enjoying the story for what it was. And that book is Dreams of the Dying by Nicholas Litzau. And I reread this book because the next 2 books of the series are finished. And they were supposed to be out this past September. And I wanted to be refreshed in the story, like refreshed on what had happened before going into books 2 and 3. Unfortunately, I think there were some delays, and I wasn't able to get a hold of books 2 and 3, but it doesn't matter. I still had just as great of a time with this book the second time as I did the first time, and I stand by my initial review with not a whole lot to add outside of that review. I will say I think knowing the story and knowing its flaws helped me enjoy it more this time around, and I doubt this will be my last time rereading the book. As far as books in 2 and 3, Nick, take as much time as you need writing them. No rush here. I can wait for something as long as it's done right. Next up is a book you've actually heard me talk about already this year, and that's The Pendragon Cycle. With me having read books 1 and 2 of this trilogy, and it's hard to pick which one's better. I think Merlin is probably technically better than Taliesin. I think he executes that story better, but the originality of Taliesin is better. What I love about these books is that they deal with like the fall of empires and the power void that's left in its wake. Like we have heroes that are relatable but still larger than life. Their plots revolve around morality, destiny, and free will, and I enjoyed the fact that this was a true fantasy romance, but not pornography. You know, the things that are typically marketed as fantasy romance or romantasy. I will have a full review of the first book, Taliesin, out, but for some reason I felt like I wanted to finish the original trilogy, so stay tuned for that one. But coming in at number 6 is, I'll say, Taliesin. Even though Merlin was technically better, I feel like the originality of Taliesin probably rates it higher in my book. Next up in the number 7 spot is, funny enough, another reread, and that book is The Dragonbone Chair. And I honestly struggled on where to put this on my list, because choosing to reread a book tells you something about that book, or it tells me something about that book. I typically reread a book because either I loved it and need it more, or I hated it and I'm giving it another chance. And it's far more often that I loved it and I needed to experience that story again. This book is kind of different. Actually, it's very different, because this book, my first experience with it was very average. I went into it with all the wrong expectations, and because of that, I struggled with the entire first half of this book. I was constantly waiting for something that is never going to come up, because this book is so much different from what I was expecting during that initial first read. So this book, since that first read, has haunted me. And with this reread, I was able to fully appreciate it for the slow, epic burn that it was. Well, maybe not fully, because even though I enjoyed the journey with this book, I was not satiated by the end. The ending was not satisfactory to me. And that might be a little bit unfair, because the ending to this story is great. It's more about the fact that my time with the characters is unconcluded. Like, I loved the journey of this book. I love the characters. I love their story. But I'm wondering if the payoff of the book as a whole is worth my time reading it. And I think that's really the key to this story. Is my favorite part of the book this time was my least favorite part of the book last time. My favorite part is the beginning, where I'm learning about Simon and who he is, about the castle he lives in, and the mystery about the man that is Morgane. I loved the flight from the castle. Like, I loved everything about that very first half of the book, the first 3/4 of the book. And the more I talk about it in this review, I think I probably should have rated it higher on this list. But the point is, you have to love this story for the journey. There was never one moment that makes that slow burn pay off. The journey is the payoff. You have to love that beginning part of the book, or you're just not going to enjoy the book. And I'm saying that, but there's several more books to read. There's 2 more books in this original trilogy. So maybe me feeling unsatisfied is a sign that I need to just pick up books 2 and 3 versus having done that reread of Dragonbone Chair. But in conclusion, I loved this book this time. I'm unsatiated by this book, and this time I was able to appreciate the journey for what it was, which is like the important part of the story. It is the good part of this book. Coming in at number 7 is The Dragonbone Chair. Moving on to number 8 is another book I had no intention of reading this year, and that is On Stranger Tides by Tim Powers. This is one of the 3 books I read after reading Treasure Island, and because of that, this book just hit perfectly. I also want to shout out Samwise because he was talking about Tim Powers in some of his videos, which also led me to this book. That's the reason why when I got in the mood for pirates and seafaring, I had books lined up in the back of my mind because he had recently mentioned it in one of his videos, I think, when I picked this up. And this book was so different from what I was used to reading. For one, just the genre itself is different. Like, it's only recently that I started to stick my head outside of the medieval fantasy type of subgenre. And this book is pirate fantasy with voodoo magic mixed in there. So it's definitely not the typical story I would seek out. And then also the storytelling itself in this book. The writing is, or maybe the storytelling cadence, is very different from what I'm used to. Like, there were probably 3 places where Tim Powers could have wrapped it up and done a whole nother book for that next story. Like 3 different climaxes that could have ended, but he just kept going with the story. And it was very interesting to see how he was able to maintain momentum and wrap it all up in a neat little bow. The other thing I really appreciated about this book was the ability for this one book, to tell a complete story. Like, I've been writing down some thoughts I've had on the power of endings and how it's kind of a lost art in the fantasy genre to have stories that actually end and don't just have sequel after sequel or sequel series after sequel series and then a prequel series. And how incredible it is to read a book that is one and done and just being able to live in that book. Tim Powers did it with that book, and it was awesome to read, and I missed that, and that's something I liked about a lot of the books I read this year. I almost gave up the name of another book later on, but so Treasure Island is a one and done. Moby Dick is a one and done. This book is a one and done. Like, they weren't sequels to sequels. There's aren't 10 more books I have to read because I read these books. They were one and dones, and I loved that. Okay, but moving on. Number 9. Number 9 is actually number 10, and I'll explain why when I get to number 10. But in all honesty, this book wouldn't even make it on my top 10 list, except for the fact that I have read way less books than normal. Some of the other books I read don't even come close. So this one somehow made it onto my top 10 list. And that book is Republic of Thieves by Scott Lynch. And it's not that this was a bad book. It just wasn't amazing. It wasn't better than average. If you're not aware with my history of the Gentleman Bastard series, it's been a roller coaster. Like, I loved The Lies of Locke Lamora to the point that I still think it was as close to perfect of a book as you can make. And that's not saying I wouldn't change anything, that I don't wish something would be different about it, but it was exactly what it's supposed to be, and it was beautiful from start to finish. Perfect. I think it's probably one of my favorite fantasy books of all time, still to this day. Red Seas Under Red Skies is completely opposite. It was far less than average, and honestly, I think it was a mess, with the main issues I have with that story being the structure, a flaw in the promises, progress, and payoff of the storytelling. And then when I finally get here to Republic of Thieves, it's much better than Red Seas Under Red Skies. But it's a far cry from Lies of Locke Lamora as well. It was an extremely average book. And I did have 2 main issues with this book. If this was outside of the Gentleman Bastard series, if this was just a story, like a one-off that Scott Lynch was writing about some other person, I honestly think this would be much better than what it is. But the first issue I have with this book is that the author is absolutely butchering the man he built up Locke Lamora to be in the first book. Like, he's taking this character from this larger than life person, amazing, superhuman, to almost a boring, unremarkable nothing of a character. Like, he is decimating this character. And the second thing I had an issue with in this book is that it had similar problems in the structure, in its promises, progress, and payoffs, where there's this elaborate political maneuvering happening in the background, but it seems to be happening despite Locke and Jean and not because of them. And I have lots more to say about this book in a full review, including the good stuff I liked about it, which I guess I skipped over here. But since I read so few books this year, this absolutely average book makes it onto number 9 this year, but really it's number 10. And that brings us to number 10, which, like I said, number 10 is not actually number 10. It's probably number 4 or 5. But the issue is I'm not done with it yet. So I feel dirty ranking it higher without actually finishing it. But this book is the 4th pirate/seafaring book I've read this year, or I'm reading this year, and it's Pirate Freedom by Gene Wolfe. It is infuriating that I can't count this book as done yet, because I started this on my Kindle app right after finishing Stranger Tides, and I was devouring it. But the sample ended. And I was in a conundrum because you can't buy this book new anymore. There is no audiobook. And the only way I was going to pay for it was by getting a physical copy. Like, I was not going to order the ebook. So I ordered this online, and the very first one, I wait like 3 weeks for it to arrive because I'm not paying any extra for shipping, and it gets lost in the mail. And there was this whole long process trying to get another one, and I only just recently got my hands on it. So I now have it. I'm reading it. I'm about halfway done. And it just took forever to get. Between when I started this book and when I'm finally having this in hand, I read Moby Dick and that Sanderson book I was talking about. But so far, this book's been incredible. So from what I can tell so far, it's about this boy who is raised in a Catholic monastery that travels back in time to the time of pirates after he decides to leave the monastery. And he, of course, gets pulled onto a pirate ship and finds himself captaining a ship. And he's telling this story from the position of a priest in modern day. So we know he somehow makes it back to the present, but we have this mystery from the start of the book that we're consistently having to ask ourselves, how does this boy go from piracy to priesthood and from the past to the future? Like, it's all very, very cool, and it gets you thinking. And within the first few chapters of this book, you can tell it is Wolfe at his finest. Like, he has honed his skills by this point in his career, and while it's different from the rest of the things I'm used to reading from him in the same vein that Wizard Knight is, it's incredible. And honestly, as I'm reading this after Treasure Island, I honestly suspect that this is kind of his response to Treasure Island. And not only that, but to Chesterson's commentary on Treasure Island. So I've never actually seen or heard Wolfe discuss Pirate Freedom like I have heard him discuss like Book of the New Sun, Book of the Long Sun, Wizard Knight. But just based off the title and the vibe and some of the stuff I'm getting from this book, I think this is his response to that. Anyways, all that to say, I think this will probably come in at number 4, but because it's not finished yet, I'm going to have to rank it at number 10 for now. I'm not ranking any of those other books I've read that are lower than this above it. That'd be ridiculous. It's ridiculous to even put Republic of Thieves above it. I just feel dirty ranking it any higher when I haven't actually completed it yet. But anyways, thanks for watching, and if you like this format of going from 1 to 10 instead of from 10 to 1, let me know in the comments below. I'm suspecting it's going to absolutely destroy this video and the algorithm, but I'm curious to hear the people who made it to the end. I want to hear their thoughts. My next video will probably be me doing kind of like a 2026 TBR video, or my reading plans, like where my current tastes lie. So like and subscribe to get notified when that drops, and thanks again for watching.